Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are going Marpling. And what book are we doing it with, Kemper?
We are doing The Moving Finger. Let's get into it and start off by talking about the publication history.
It was serialized first in the U.S., in Collier's in spring 1942, and then it was published in book form in the U.S. in July 1942 by Don Mead. But then, weirdly enough, it was serialized in Woman's Pictorial in the fall of 1942 in the UK, and then not published until June 1943 by Collins Crime, almost an entire year later from its US publication, which is actually a pretty long time.
It is. I actually have a little bit of intel on that. So, according to Janet Morgan, biographer, who we reference quite a bit on this podcast, the Saturday Evening Post, which was a more regular UK serializer of Christie's novels before they were published in book form, actually declined to serialize this novel on the grounds that it started too slowly for a newspaper serial. And we come across this issue again because this is one of the few Christie novels wherein the text differs significantly.
In the U.S.
Yeah, between the U.S. and the U.K. versions, because the way that the U.S. newspaper Collier's dealt with that problem was apparently to cut about 9,000 words from the text in backstory and minor characters. I think a lot of those cuts are front-loaded. And for whatever reason, it actually does seem to have been a mistake that just got perpetuated throughout subsequent U.S. editions. When it was published via Dodd Mead, they used that abridged newspaper serialization.
Right.
They should have apparently used the longer unabridged version, but they didn't. They were supplied the serialized version. I believe that the newest HarperCollins editions published here in the U.S.
Is the UK version
are true UK versions whenever there is a discrepancy. I know that was certainly the case when we covered 3-Act Tragedy, which is one of the other novels that also has some significant differences between UK and US editions. Little quirk of publication in this novel that we don't normally get in the Christie novels between US and UK. Let's move on and begin, as we always do, with our victims. And this is a poison pen novel. I mean, I think most people, the shorthand that they would use for it is that, oh yeah, this is Christie's poison pen novel. Lots of nasty letters going back and forth in a small village. So we could say that we have a whole passel of victims in that every person who receives a poison pen letter is one. But we also have 2 murder victims, 2 people who die in the course of the story. And the first is Mrs. Symington, who is a local mother of 3 and who seems to commit suicide by ingesting cyanide of potassium after receiving one of those poison pen letters.
And then we have Agnes Waddle. She's the Symington's maid, and she's bashed over the head and then stabbed through the back of the neck with a poker of some kind and then tossed into a closet.
It is one of Christie's more violent deaths.
Like, one of those things isn't bad enough. It's just one on top of the other.
Not cozy, our Christie.
Not at all.
Not at all. All right, let's talk about our suspects. And it is everyone in this small town of Lymstock. And we are going to go through this list very quickly.
It's more people, frankly, than are even listed here.
Yeah, like we're actually abridging this list, believe it or not, because it's just not worth going through literally everyone in the town of Lymstock who is mentioned in this book. But everyone who is mentioned, at least there's the possibility that they could have certainly been writing the poison pen letters, and in that those letters are connected to the murder, everyone is a suspect. Truly everyone is a suspect. So starting off first with our first-person male narrator, Jerry Burton, a pilot and rich Londoner who was recently injured in a flying accident and who is recovering in the village of Lymstock.
Then we have Joanna Burton, who's his sister, who is staying with him in the house in Lymstock. She's a bit of a London social butterfly, very fashionable.
Next up, we've got Miss Emily Barton, the owner of Little Furs, which is the house in Lymstock that the Burtons are staying at. And she needs money, which is why she has let it to them. And while they stay in her house, she is staying with her former housekeeper in town.
And then we have Partridge, who's the maid at the house. And she's a stickler for the old rules. And she doesn't seem to have all that much respect for the Burton siblings because, you know, they are not the Barton family.
Next up, we've got Dr. Owen Griffith. He's the town doctor, and he definitely has a sort of love-hate, will they, won't they thing going on with Joanna pretty much from the get-go.
And then we have Miss Amy Griffith, Dr. Griffith's spinster sister. Her name is not spelled A-M-Y. It is spelled A-I-M-E-E in the French style, which is a joke, because she is very aggressive about forcing everything onto her neighbors, like joining the Scouts, joining the Women's Institute, joining charitable organizations, having gossip about them. She's a peach.
Let's just say that she greets the Burtons on their doorstep with the phrase, "Hello, slackers." I was like, did Christie just use the word slackers?
You've got a real attitude problem, McFly. You're a slacker.
One of my favorite things about this novel is the way that Miss Amy Griffith is dispatched at the end, which we will get to. Then we have Mr. Richard Symington, who is the town lawyer and husband to our first victim, Mona Symington.
Then we have Miss Megan Hunter, Mona's 20-year-old weirdo daughter from her first marriage to an imprisoned blackmailer, who I'm pretty sure is the basis for Allison, the Ally Sheedy character in Breakfast Club.
You want to know what I did to get in here? Nothing. I didn't have anything better to do.
Am I wrong?
You're not. Megan is an interesting character. We will talk more about that. Next up, Miss Elsie Holland, who is the beautiful nursery governess for the Symingtons' two young boys, though she does lack essay.
We have Miss Ginch, who's the Symington secretary, who is also a weirdo.
And in that vein, next up, we've got Mr. Pye, who is definitely effeminate, almost definitely a gay man. And he is a collector and general local eccentric.
Speaking again of local eccentrics, we have Mrs. Cleet, who is the local witch.
Of course.
I mean,
of course we do. And rounding out this never-ending list, we have the Reverend Caleb Dane Calthrop, who is the reverend within the town and who is in a definitely sexless marriage to his equally weird wife, Mrs. Maud Dane Calthrop, who is a truth teller and friend of one Miss Jane Marple. There are some other people within this book. There are the Bakers, mother and daughter. There is Florence, who is Miss Emily's former housekeeper. There is Rose, the cook at the Symingtons, et cetera, et cetera. But we are just going to breeze right on over them because they are minor suspects at best. And that is a long enough list as it is. Catherine Brobeck, tell us about the world as it appears to be.
Jerry Burton, our first person narrator. He's told by his doctor that he needs to move from the excesses of London in order to convalesce from his plane crash-related injuries. He's been using crutches, but now he's down to a cane, but he still needs like a solid 3 to 6 months relaxing in the country in order to properly heal. So he and his sister, Joanna, find this lovely house in the village of Lymstock in order to speed up his recovery.
By the way, Emily Barton, who, is letting them the house, assumes that his injuries are war-related, and he doesn't correct her, but it's never made absolutely clear that his injuries are war-related. And then in both adaptations of the story, which we'll of course talk about later,
it's made clear that it's not the war.
That it's not the war, which I found curious. Just pointing that out there. Reading the book, one would think that it probably was a war injury, but then the adaptations complicate that question. And our Jerry is such a complicated man that it's just worth pondering the question, I think, as close readers of the text, which is why I bring it up. In any case, within very short order, Jerry and Joanna are sent an anonymous letter via post made up of crazy person cutout letters. Like this is straight out of, Silk Stocking / Lifetime thriller movie of choice.
It's glue. So, somebody had access to a pair of scissors and some glue.
Right. This letter says that Joanna looks like a harlot, and that she and Jerry obviously aren't brother and sister, but lovers. They burn the letter.
Immediately thereafter, they discover that they are not the first people to receive a poison pen letter. So it's not just some new-to-town hazing ritual. In fact, it's been pretty constantly. Every single person in town has been getting one, from little old ladies to the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, etc. If you live in Lymstock, you have received a poison pen letter. The strangest part of the letters, though, and we find this out very early, is that everyone who has received one more or less says that the letters aren't true, which is, well, I mean, of course you'd say that even if they were true, but we know from the Burton siblings that their letter wasn't. So it seems plausible that the other ones aren't either, which is odd. And we also learned that most of the townsfolk have been attributing it to Mrs. Cleed, who is the quote-unquote local witch, but she basically seems like a blackmailer.
Yeah, interesting town that the Burton siblings have happened upon here.
Right.
We then spend a long, long time meeting every single person who has ever lived in the village, and we just walked through all those people rather quickly, so we will gloss over them once again and just note that there are some odd things happening here. The oddest is definitely Megan Hunter, who, in addition to being Allison from The Breakfast Club, is also apparently the girl from The Ring. She's just got hair in her face at all times. She kind of lurches around.
Yeah, climbing through your television screen.
Yeah. She's just lurking and lurching, and everyone seems to think that she's sort of developmentally challenged. The way that people treat her is very odd. They keep on talking about how young she is and how she's just a child, but she is 20 years old. And Jerry thinks she's interesting, and Joanna sort of feels bad for her. So immediately they just have some sympathy for her that no one else in the village seems to have.
And then, on top of all that, Megan's mother kills herself. She receives a poison pen letter basically saying that the youngest one of the Symington sons, who is naturally a redhead, is not Mr. Symington's child at all. So she apparently takes a healthy dose of cyanide and is found by her husband in bed, dead, with the letter balled as if to be thrown into the fire, and a torn piece of paper curled in her hand that reads, "I can't go on."
The police are naturally involved in the poison pen letter business after this, and they begin investigating all of that, focusing their attention on unwell or just off middle-aged women or women in need of attention. There's a general assumption that this has to be a woman because women write poison pen letters.
In the meantime, Jerry and Joanna take in Megan from the Symingtons because they feel terrible for her. She's been getting ignored while Elsie and Mr. Symington seem to be moving in on each other a little bit, which is creepy because Mrs. Symington died a few days ago. It turns out when she's actually in their house, Megan turns out to be really smart, if sullen and ignored. Again, see under Allison for Breakfast Club.
She doesn't talk, sir.
Anyway, it seems really clear that Jerry is Emilio Estevezing like nobody's business. Well, at the same time, Joanna's been getting photographs of diseased spleens from Dr. Griffith, which I guess is their fun, flirty, cool way of courting.
I actually thought that was a funny scene in the book when Jerry's like, what is that? And she's absentmindedly like, oh, it's a photo of a diseased spleen. Dr. Griffith thought I would be interested. And he's like, okay. Joanna and Dr. Griffith seem to have a thing going on here.
Although the critical thing about that photograph is that Jerry realizes that it's curling up, and because he wants to save this memento, he tries to press it.
He tries to press it in a book, a big old book from the 19th century that he never would have opened otherwise, on the bookshelf in Little Furs, Emily Barton's house again, that they are letting. And he finds that there are a number of pages was cut out of the book, and that this must be the book that was used for the cutout letters from the crazy poison pen writer, because they do know based on the font of those letters that it had to be from a book in the 19th century. So the police figure that out with Jerry's help, but they also figure out one other thing, which is that the typewriter used to type the addresses on the outsides of the envelopes of these poison pen letters is the typewriter that sits in the Women's Institute in town, and that typewriter had previously belonged to the Symingtons before being donated there. However, the person who wrote these poison pen letters wasn't typing properly. Oh no, they were using a, wait for it, moving finger, i.e. ye old hunt and peck. That was so that the keystrokes of a regular typing hand were not used, which would have potentially revealed something about the user's typing patterns. I don't really understand that.
I do, because think about what your dominant hand is and how you actually type and what your habits are. So in an ink typewriter, if you hit a key hard enough, you're going to get a deeper groove in the letter or harder ink press. So you can tell somebody's typing habits based on how the letters are being hit.
It's the impression that the ink is making on the paper as it stamps it. And that would
enable you to tell what was a dominant hand and what their regular typing pattern was. And you can compare that to other typewritten text. Right. So, fun fact for anybody who has never used a typewriter, that is actually a thing that happens.
Got it. Okay. Well, after these discoveries, we're edging now more into the second half of the book, I would say. Megan abruptly leaves the Burtons, Jerry and Joanna, and she goes home to her family. And in part, it seems that Miss Amy Griffith, the super energetic busybody, said something nasty to her to get her to do so. I believe she implied that it wasn't nice having Elsie and her stepfather alone in their house because people were talking. So Megan goes home, and just after that, Partridge, that is the housekeeper for Jerry and Joanna, she receives a phone call from Agnes Waddle, who is a maid over at the Symingtons, asking if Agnes might come over on her day off to get Partridge's advice. But Agnes never shows up, and the next morning, Megan, Shea Symington, finds Agnes's corpse in a closet underneath the stairs, bashed over the head and stabbed at the base of the neck.
So the investigation continues. Jerry has a really weird fever dream about weird letter parts and notes and the idea that there's smoke where there's fire. And then he wakes up to see Maud Dane Calthrop in his drawing room talking at him, and she's actually there. It's not a fever dream. And she says, this has to end. This can't go on. And so she's going to bring in an expert. And Jerry says, well, she can't go to Scotland Yard herself, and also they're already consulting. So what is she talking about? Maud waves him off and says, well, that's not what she means. That's not the expert she's talking about.
I wonder who she could possibly be talking about.
I don't know, given that we are 3/4 of the way through this book at this point.
Seriously. Before we get to our clues, which I'm very excited for, we need to cover one bizarre sequence within this novel, which is Jerry going to his doctor in London, and he's being seen off at the train station on the platform by Megan. And Jerry is, just berating her about how she looks and how embarrassing she is and how he's sick and tired of her just being so embarrassing and she could do better. And he yanks her onto the train by her arm, and he brings her to Joanna's seamstress and hairdresser, and she very much gets a Princess Diaries makeover.
I love your eyebrows. We'll call them Frida and Color.
And after this half a day spent in London...
If Brooke Shields married the Groucho Marx, that child would have your eyebrows.
She is lithe and elegant and beautiful. And, well, she already was a good dancer, but now, of course, since she looks the part, that just falls into place. And apparently she has made herself marriage worthy. And Jerry, who has been slowly yet surely falling in love with her over the course of this book, is just now head over heels. All right. We'll have more to say about that in a little bit. Let's talk about the world as it actually is, because we know exactly who Maud Dane Calthrop brought in. It, of course, was one Miss Jane Marple, who asks for a recounting of events from Jerry and Joanna's perspective, all of which she finds very interesting indeed. And we have some clues to go over here. Catherine Brobeck, take it away.
So clue number 1. We will circle back to this, but let's just call it what it is. It's Occam's razor. Basically, in a series of extremely complex seeming scenarios, the simplest solution is most often the correct one. So the deduction in here is we can basically upfront dispense with a lot of quote-unquote clues and consider the motive of the core crime, so not the poison pen letters. But what's the actual crime here? The crime is 2 murders. So who are the victims and who stands to gain and who has the opportunity? And looking at that, as Miss Marple does, this entire mystery has an extremely simple solution.
This is giving it away, but there's one question that boils down the entire book. Who do you look to when a wife gets murdered?
Yeah, and that's Miss Marple's main point here.
Yeah. Clue number 2 is timing, as it so often is in Christie, but this isn't really going to help out even an astute reader. It certainly doesn't help the police until we're told the solution at the end, but we would do well to think about who could go in and out of the Symington house in the allotted windows of time on the 2 Wednesdays when the servants weren't there, or not supposed to be there anyway, which is when these 2 murders took place. And they did both take place at the Symington house. So the deduction here is that we're looking at a limited number of people and they're all in the Symington household. So
correct.
That, that really focuses our energies.
Right. So clue number 3, who didn't get a poison pen letter? Well, Jerry tells the police that Miss Barton didn't get one, but the police know that's not true because it turns out her protective former housekeeper had been stealing them from the mail so as to not upset her, which is both creepy and sweet, I suppose. So that means the only other person in this entire town who doesn't get a poison pen letter is Elsie. So the deduction here is either Elsie is a letter writer or there is another reason for her to not get one, i.e. perhaps somebody doesn't want to say anything bad about her because maybe they only have nice or romantic feelings towards her.
Interesting. Clue number 4. What did Agnes see? Remember, Agnes is our second victim. And this is actually a really clever clue. Very, very classic Christie here. Because it's inverting our assumptions. We, of course, think that Agnes was killed since she had a fight with her boyfriend, which was unforeseen. And she went back to the Symington house early. This was her afternoon off, right? Or her day off. Right. And she unforeseeably went back to the house. And what we assume is that she must have seen whoever dropped off the poison pen letter that Mrs. Symington found that led Mrs. Symington to kill herself. And of course, that person would have to be, if not then we get into the philosophical question of whether or not that person, quote unquote, killed Mrs. Symington, but they certainly seem to have killed Agnes, who saw them. So they would be the murderer. But the deduction here for a super astute Christie reader is, what if it's more complicated than that? What if it's the inverse? What if it's about what Agnes didn't see? In other words, Agnes, who wasn't supposed to be there, could have been witness to the fact as she's looking out the window, seeing if her boyfriend, who she's just been fighting with, is going to come back and make amends with her. What if she saw no one drop off the poison pen letter? And what if she eventually figured out from that the call was coming from inside the house, so to speak, i.e. whoever gave Mrs. Symington that poison pen letter was a member of the household.
Already in the house. Yeah.
Interesting.
It's a clever clue.
It's a clever clue.
Clue number 5, the scrap of paper in Mrs. Symington's hand that reads, "I can't go on." And it bothers Jerry, but he can't put his finger on why. And it bothers him again later when he reads this note that Joanna leaves about a message to give to Dr. Griffith if he should call when she's out. The note that Joanna leaves is a little harder and it has to be explicated by Miss Marple, but the deduction here is pretty simple, and it's that people don't usually write suicide notes on scraps of torn off paper. As Miss Marple will later kind of note, sometimes they write them on full sheets of stationery and put them in envelopes. But basically a torn off scrap that's in your hand after you've swallowed some cyanide is, at a minimum, an odd choice of suicide note.
Right. This is another classic Christie clue, and I really like it because it has that element of inevitability after the fact where you're like, oh, of course, that makes a lot of sense. Why didn't I see that? But you probably didn't because it's clever. We've had this exact clue before, but she's played even fairer in that she has reproduced these sort of torn scraps of letters or notes in previous novels. We had it in Lord Edgeworth Dies, I believe, where there was a letter torn off, an actual character torn off of a letter to transform she into he, for example, and that was reproduced in the book. But even so, we are told that it's torn. So it is a fair clue for sure. Then we have clue number 6, which is very simple. We already really mentioned this, which is that the poison pen letters aren't saying anything true. And that is unusual. And it's not clear cut because maybe they are saying something true. We don't know that for sure, but that does seem to be indicated at least by the letter that Joanna and Jerry received. And the conclusion that Miss Marple leaps to here, the deduction, is a little uncomfortable because she's assuming that, well, if this is our garden variety crazy lady poison pen writer, she would be writing true things because gossip is often true. I mean, Miss Marple has made that point in the past that most people think gossip is nonsense, but actually most gossip is totally true.
Right. No, it's for sure true. Most of us know that in our regular lives. You know, we will hear fragments of stories and, you know, maybe they're brushed aside, but deep down, you know, they're probably true.
This is a salient point by Miss Marple, but she then takes it a little bit further and deduces that perhaps these letters are red herrings. Like if they're not real and this poison pen writer isn't trying to upset people by telling them true things, then maybe they're just trying to obfuscate something alternately devious. And we've seen obfuscation ploys in so many Christie novels before, most famously the ABC murders, a fake serial killer as a means of obfuscating the true murder, 3-act tragedy as well. So that also, I think, counts as a classic Christie. And
and also we've seen the obfuscation in Murder is Easy.
Yeah, that's true. We have. Yeah. And that was another essentially almost serial killer, just small town serial killer, you know, kill a whole bunch of people and make it seem like it was the person who you want to be executed. We'll be getting back to Murder is Easy because there are a lot of parallels between that novel and this one. Final clue here is also a Christie tried and true because we saw it in a previous Miss Marple story that we covered, The Herb of Death. And I like to call this the Randy Old Man clue, which is really gross.
Oh, it's really gross.
Christie clearly firmly believed that when older men fell for younger women, they fell hard. And that is the crux of The Herb of Death. So hard that they just might commit murder to get their lady. So do we know of any older men, if we're trying to deduce something from this clue, do we know of any older men who have been living in close proximity to a younger woman for quite some time? Say, a young woman whose beauty is commented upon over and over again? Elsie the governess, perhaps, who has been under Mr. Symington's employ for quite some time? Just a thought.
It's a possibility.
Let's bring this home, Catherine.
So, our resolution. Jerry has just asked Megan to marry him. She's taken a hard pass. He's really pretty offended by that, but, you know, she seems to be in the right here. And then immediately after, Miss Griffith is arrested because the police directly saw her writing a final poison pen letter on the typewriter in the Women's Institute. This one finally written to Elsie about what a home-wrecking harlot she is. And Miss Griffith can't even fight the police off. She's humiliated and taken to jail weeping. And then on top of that, Dr. Griffith turns down Joanna's attempt to essentially marry him because of the scandal. So both siblings are rejected. Miss Griffith is arrested.
There's an argument to be made that that's the true ending of the world as it appears to be, because it almost seems like Miss Griffith did it. You know, I mean, she was caught. Right. She was caught red-handed. But thank God we have Miss Marple there. So Jerry, of course, is all about pursuing Megan. He desperately wants to talk with her, especially now that she has that glossy, new, perfect chestnut hair. And he sees Megan talking to Miss Marple, but then Megan runs off, and Miss Marple tells him in so many words to back off. And that, and that Megan is a very courageous girl. And when Miss Marple starts talking about people being courageous, you know, capable of facing danger, that's when we should get worried, because Miss Marple is known for hatching traps, isn't she?
Oh, Miss Marple seems to love hatching a trap, and she seems to have a limited consideration of the relative amount of danger that might put other people in.
Well, you know, when innocent people's happiness is at stake, she thinks that people should not shirk from danger.
Right.
That's such a Christie thing. She hates the idea of people not being brave and facing danger for the sake of others and their own happiness, et cetera, et cetera. We've been there before.
Right. But Jerry, being such a Jerry, decides instead to ignore Miss Marple and go late at night to the Symington house and lurk like a creep outside, where he then eavesdrops on an entire conversation between Elsie and Mr. Symington, which is like flirty and fun and talking kind of about sending the boys off to boarding school. And then Megan interrupts. Again, Jerry is witnessing all of this from the dark outside of the house. She sends Elsie away. She closes the door. She says to Mr. Symington, she would like a check, and she would like it right now, please. And Mr. Symington says, well, she's going to get her inheritance in a few months when she turns 21. And she tells him, well, that's fine and good, but she wants a check from him because she saw what he put in her mother's prescription. And he writes her a check, and she goes off. And Jerry then at that point tries to bolt into the house and go after her, but is tackled by the police.
Right, and then the police oddly decide to let Jerry accompany them into the house a bit later, where Mr. Symington Mr. Symington is caught quite off guard, carrying an unconscious, drugged Megan into the kitchen, where he has turned on the gas in the oven and is sticking her head in. Our friend, actually, John Curran, makes note of this. This is an extremely oddly structured Christie novel because it is very unusual to have the murderer revealed before the explanation. Right. It's usually simultaneous or slightly after. But here we definitely see proof that Mr. Symington is the murderer because he's trying to kill Megan. And we don't know why, unless we figured it out. But Miss Marple hasn't explained any of it yet. So it is interestingly structured. Obviously, the police have all the evidence they need. And now it is time for Miss Marple to explain all.
She had gone to the police. She had convinced Megan to cooperate in essentially a sting operation because they don't have good enough evidence otherwise.
Miss Marple's explanation, once you get right down to it, is very, very simple, which is that Mr. Symington wanted to have fun, sexy times with his beautiful nanny, and he needed his wife gone because he wanted to keep his house and his sons. So he created an entire fake poison pen letter system
for
months before. I mean, it's funny because I refuse to include it as a clue in our list of clues, but it is referenced as a clue in the novel, but I think it is so useless. There is note made by Jerry that in one of the poison pen letters that they receive, the name Burton, the U had been superimposed over an A.
An A, right.
So clearly, you know, it read Miss Barton, Little Furs, but then the A was made into a U. He says, oh, that was a clue and we should have realized it then. The only thing you get out of that is that these letters had been made in advance because the Burtons moved in recently, but that doesn't get you much.
That is actually a really weird clue because it only had to be the envelopes that were pre-typed.
To me, all that gets you is that the Burtons definitely didn't do it because they recently moved there, but everyone else has lived in the village for years, so that doesn't eliminate anyone.
No.
So he set that all up, and, you know, when they still had the typewriter at their house before donating it to the Women's Institute, he typed up all those envelopes. And by the way, the poison pen letter he sent to his wife that everyone in town knew because it was then read out at the inquest involved one of his sons potentially not being his son, which then everyone thought what might be true.
Which is crazy because part of the reason why he kills her is because he doesn't want to give custody up of his sons.
Right. It's that. So we'll talk about that when we get to plot credibility.
Right. And Miss Griffith really did write that last poison pen letter, except it was typewritten. It was not cut and pasted. And she really did write it because it turns out she'd been in love with Mr. Symington for years. And where have we seen that? Where have we seen that clue before?
Murder is Easy, perhaps?
Perhaps so.
So much of this is a rehash of
yeah.
murders, which, you know, it feels like that was written a long time ago, but Christie wrote so many novels so quickly. It was only a couple of years before this novel, believe it or not. In any case, we have some pairings as well that have to happen here.
We have a lot of pairings.
A lot of pairings. Of course, Jerry and Megan end up living happily ever after, and Joanna and Dr. Griffith. And I mentioned this earlier, my favorite pairing is Miss Barton and the exonerated Miss Griffith. I mean, yes, she wrote that one letter, but we've all had a bad day, and she had a very bad day. They decide to go on an around-the-world spinster cruise.
Yeah. And they just, they don't even know when they'll come back.
Because what's so good about that is Miss Griffith is such a pain throughout the novel that I almost feel like part of the obstacle to Joanna ending up with Dr. Griffith is that she'd have to deal with Miss Griffith.
Oh my
and now
gosh.
she's kind of taken out of the equation, which is pretty great. The end. Let's talk about the adaptations. As we so often do with Miss Marple novels, we have two, one of them in the 80s and one of them much more recent. I am going to just come out and say this, Catherine. This might be the most controversial thing I have ever said on this podcast.
You like the newer one more?
Yup. That is correct. Here's the thing. And we actually had a while ago a listener to the podcast email us and make an impassioned plea for the Geraldine McEwen and Julia Mackenzie adaptations. And one of her arguments that she made, I remember, was in reference to The Moving Finger, and specifically the Joan Hickson version of The Moving Finger, which she said was terrible. And I hadn't seen it in recent memory when I read that, and I was like, that can't be true. That just can't be true. None of the Joan Hickson adaptations was terrible. They're all wonderful. And this one isn't terrible, but I think it has to be one of the weakest because it had a lot of problems. So this aired in 1985. It was actually the second episode of the overall series. And like some of these Joan Hickson adaptations, they're not scored very much. They sometimes have this airless quality to them, which affects pacing. And I found that to be very much the case here. There are weird guitar riffs that sort of belie the 80s origins of the series, which Mark Aldrich actually talks about in his book, which is why I was attuned to them.
Miss Holland!
It's very jarring. So Jerry himself is played by Andrew Bicknell, who we last saw in the Agatha Christie Hour, Jane in Search of a Job. And I think he totally looks like a young Prince William. I'm going to post a photo. I have photographic evidence of it. I did a screen capture.
All right. I will wait for the photographic evidence. Megan's rocking a 1980s mullet.
Oh, yeah.
And Joanna also looks kind of like maybe she was just in some casual glamour ads from 1985. There's very little period about them, which is really odd.
Yeah, they both look extremely 80s. Maybe I just had the royals on the brain, but Megan looked like a extremely poor man's Princess Diana.
Yeah, she did.
Right?
She sort of had, it's a really bad, almost bowl cut thing that's going on.
The specific element of the Hickson adaptation that our listener identified as so bad in the Hickson version is the makeover montage, where they cut to a series of photos of Jerry taking her to London, and it is weird and not in a good way. The Geraldine McEwen version, so this aired in season/series 2 of the ITV Marple series in 2006. We so often complain about how unfaithful these adaptations can be in a not interesting way, but this one is very faithful. There are some tonal changes. You know, the story opens up with Jerry in bed with a prostitute, drinking himself silly and then getting into a motorcycle accident on purpose. And he's lying in the grass and he seems dead. And then there's a close-up of his hand and one of his fingers twitches. And then the title splashes, The Moving Finger. And I was like, oh, come on. But it gets better from there. We are going to be interviewing a friend of the podcast very soon, Jamie Bernthal, who has a lot to say on the ITV adaptation and what it is doing with the character of Mr. Pye, who is our gay character from the text, because of course they have to do this in the ITV version and just up the homosexual element. There is this scene where he essentially comes out to everyone, and it's mainly played for laughs, and it's very distasteful, but it's a very small, isolated part of the overall adaptation.
Well, in the Joan Hickson one, though, he says, well, I had to leave London when my ... partner left. And he says, well, why would anybody write me a poison pen letter about it? And Miss Marple goes,
Oh, I'm sure I don't know, Mr. Barry.
It's not like it's not being done in the 1985 version.
No, it's true. It's beaten over our heads, as it always is in the ITV version. And the scene itself is not helping the adaptation at all.
I hope this puts an end to the rumor and doubt surrounding his death. There was no murder, only malice. No issue of paternity, only love he dared not express. And I, for one, will always remember him.
Miss Holland, please take the boys home.
But I found its effect to be limited to that scene, and I harp on that so much that I'm not going to for this one. The one change that they also made that was interesting, and I think just kind of has to be done in any 21st century adaptation of this book, because it's so upsetting to a 21st century reader, is that makeover montage. Because in the book, when Jerry's just berating her, and then he basically just rips her along to this forced...
She literally is knocked onto the floor of the train car.
It's like an involuntary makeover montage.
Yeah.
And it's preserved in the Joan Hickson version, but in the ITV version, they don't make that big of a deal of it. And it's Joanna who helps her, which makes perfect sense. It's Joanna who helps her just kind of prettify herself. And it's all very basic and not interesting, but it's just less weird, and it at least doesn't stick out as much as it does in the text. But I thought that James D'Arcy did a very good job playing Jerry overall in that adaptation, and I enjoyed it more than the Hickson. So how often can I say that? That's probably going to be the only time that I ever say that, but I will say it here. All right, let's talk about rankings. I believe we've mentioned this before, but Christie herself was a really big fan of this title.
I know she was.
She cited it as one of her 10 favorites when she was asked in 1972 what her favorite novels were, which of course begs the question, what were the other 9? But we will deal with that at a later point. And this is what she wrote about it in her autobiography. Of my detective books, I think the 2 that satisfy me best are Crooked House and Ordeal by Innocence, neither of which we've covered yet. Rather to my surprise, on rereading them the other day, I find that another one I am really pleased with is The Moving Finger. It is a great test to reread what one has written some 17 or 18 years later. One's view changes, some do not stand the test of time, others do. And there's a lot of affection for The Moving Finger among Christie aficionados. Laura Thompson, whose opinion I often agree with, more recent biographer of Christie, has a lot of good things to say about the characters within the village and the overall setting that Christie creates, but I didn't like it as much as I expected to, given how much affection I knew Christie had for it and other Christie scholars have for it.
Well, I will say this. I was looking forward to reading it, and part of the reason why I was looking forward to reading it is I didn't really remember it. I remembered the poison pen stuff, but I didn't really remember any of the rest of the plot, and reading it,
there's a reason for that.
That's where I come down on it. Is like, I think I now know why I didn't remember what the plot was. I will not say that I had a hard time reading it. It is perfectly breezy to read. My biggest takeaway was, oh my God, this is Murder is Easy, and they inserted Miss Marple at the end.
I actually wrote down some similarities to Murder is Easy, because by the time I finished this, that was what was in my head more than anything. Like, wow, this feels like Murder is Easy.
Right.
We've got a small village with lots of spinster ladies, and even though Christie is stereotyped as always setting her mysteries in small villages, she actually doesn't do it.
Most of them aren't. No.
Most of them aren't. She actually doesn't do it as much as you would think, so that is significant. The story is told by by a male narrator who is a stranger to the small village where the action takes place. There is lots of local witchcraft and weirdness. We've got Mrs. Cleet and Mr. Pie. We had all the sort of satanic goings on with the
another antiques collector.
Another antiques collector. Jamie notes that in his book, antiques collector was a shorthand that people were using at the time for a gay person. That was a reference that would not have gone unremarked by readers at the time. And then there's this central conceit of an older woman having been in love for years, decades even, with an older man. In this case, the older man is the murderer instead of the older woman. And instead of trying to frame the older man for murder because she's now finally turned on him in her despair, this woman accidentally implicates herself by trying to throw off the younger woman who he's in love with. But it's not exactly the same thing, but it's a similar conceit.
No, but in this, Symington implicates the woman. It's the inverse. He leaves the pages in her house to be found by the police.
Oh, true. Well, does he do that after, though, she writes the letter?
Yeah, he does.
Right.
After.
So he's taking advantage of the fact that
he's taking advantage of the situation.
But no, that's a fair point. It's not exactly what's happening in Murder is Easy, but it feels
but you have the same idea that Murder is Easy looks like it's a plot about a serial killer.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you think that The Moving Finger is a plot about a poison pen letter writer. It's the same setup.
We talked about this in Murder is Easy, which we came down much harder on than a lot of Christie fans would. And I know that's a little bit of a point of contention.
I've softened a little bit on it as some time has passed, but yes.
I haven't, and the reason why is that the means of obfuscation in Murder is Easy, as we discussed, is very similar to the means of obfuscation in ABC Murders. But the ABC Murders is written with so much more flair, and the characters are so much more interesting, and there's so much more going on in that novel. It's why that novel is really one of Christie's best, even though it's slightly unsung, although maybe not as much now that we have this splashy new adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
To me, Murder is Easy. It's taking a similar idea, but it's just doing it for Christie, a B way. And this one kind of feels like that too, to my surprise. No one writes a male first-person narration as well as Christie, and it's interesting that she chooses men over and over again and so rarely chooses women, but she did it a lot better in The Murder at the Vicarage, when it was the vicar himself who was narrating, and she's done it a lot better in other Hastings novels. I mean, Jerry is meant to be a little bit of a jerk.
Right.
That has to be purposeful. At the very end of the novel, when Miss Barton is kind of twittering to Jerry within the village about, isn't it wonderful that everything turns out for the best? This is like almost the last page of the novel. Jerry says, just for a fleeting moment, I thought of Mrs. Symington and Agnes Waddle and their graves in the churchyard and wondered if they would agree. And then I remembered that Agnes's boy hadn't been very fond of her, and that Mrs. Symington hadn't been very nice to Megan, and what the hell? We've all got to die sometime! !
I know, I read that and I was just like, whoa, that's one way to end a first-person narration.
Yeah, it's like she's playing fast and loose with Jerry. She's making bold choices, which I normally like, but she doesn't completely pull it off somehow.
I will tell you why I think it is, and it's because we are supposed to have some investment in his relationship with Megan.
Yeah.
And because of that, it doesn't work at all.
And that's where probably being 21st century readers makes this an even harder read. The Megan stuff is so weird. He has these affectionate terms for her that he uses every now and then.
Oh my gosh, and some of them are terrible.
Well, they are funny face, slab face, and catfish. I cringed every time he used it. And the Megan relationship is just, it's bizarre and it's slightly problematic. But you know what? Anne Bedingfield's relationship with the man in the brown suit was problematic too. And that did not ruin my enjoyment of that novel. Because part of the problem is also just with Megan as a character. I think we're supposed to find her a lot more interesting than she is.
She seems abused.
I think Christie was going for something and not quite pulling it off with her too. These characters are not coming through for me totally. And a lot of them are just not very developed because this is a large cast of characters in a village. I keep on quoting Jamie here, probably because we're going to talk to him soon. But he had a funny quote about Mr. Pie, who not surprisingly he talks a lot about in his book, Queering Agatha Christie. And he said, as a character, he is sufficiently underwritten to accommodate anything thesis about Christie and homosexuality. Pi has been read as proof of his creator's homophobia and as proof of her liberalism. That doesn't surprise me because he's barely in the book. There are a lot of people that fall into that category of just underdeveloped village types, and then the ones who we do see more of, to me, just didn't totally come through.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been talking now about the characters a lot and about the murder is easy, but, I mean, should we talk specifically about where that places this?
Yeah, let's talk about that. And let's start with plot mechanics. This story has solid, clever clues as we went through.
Yeah, it does.
It's a puzzle mystery, and it has a strong backbone.
I mean, my problem with it would be, and you can tell given they cut out 9,000 words of the U.S. edition, this book is a little bit a glorified short story.
Because it's so simple.
Yeah. And because we've seen her do similar things in short stories where she's done more complex plots, frankly, in 15 pages.
Right.
And so, you know, a lot of this is like meeting every single person in the village, hearing about their poison pen letters, and none of it matters.
Ultimate simplicity is not a bad thing in Christie. The best Christies do have an ultimate simplicity, but when it then makes you realize in hindsight that 3/4 of what you read was pointless, that's not satisfying.
No, and mechanically, the other issue here is that Miss Marple acts as this sort of deus ex machina so late into it, and mostly all of the plot is happening in like the last section of the book. You could just cut out most of the rest of it.
I think that's true. I think you wanted to give this a 6, and I actually think that's fair. We gave Sad Cypress a 6, and we gave 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe a 6. And this feels to me like it has some of the fundamental problems of a 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe, but I don't think we should be ranking it any lower than that either. So I'm okay with the 6.
By me.
Okay. So plot credibility, you know, this is where we run into the issue of, does this really make sense that this is the way that someone would go about obfuscating the murder of their wife? And again, this is endemic to the murder mystery, so it's fun to have Rube Goldberg.
Right. And his actual motivation makes total sense, right? He wants to marry the hot nanny.
He's a horny old guy who's hot for nanny, so he needs to kill his wife. No,
right.
it makes total sense, and the reason why he kills Agnes makes sense too, the maid. It's just that the elaborate nature of it.
Poison pen letters is just, whoa.
And I would argue, so for example, ABC Murders had the exact same problem because
we were supposed to nationwide serial killer manhunt
for purposes of killing your brother and inheriting his money. However, the character of the murderer in that novel, when he was revealed, was believably crazed and grandiose enough that you could at least pay lip service to, well, maybe he actually would have done that. I don't even think we got to know Mr. Symington enough to even make that judgment. And we gave a 6, actually, in plot credibility to ABC Murders because of that. I remember that was the big ding that we gave to it, that really wasn't that believable. And I think this one fares slightly worse. I would give it a 5.
That's what I gave it.
I didn't even know that. Oh, well, we're in sync even when we're not in sync, Catherine. All right, so a 6 and a 5. And that feels right to me, an 11 out of 20 for plot, because there really are some problems, but it's not egregious, and we've certainly gone a lot lower in other novels. Moving on to series-long characters, this is not going to come as a surprise that we did not like how little Miss Marple there is in this novel.
I didn't even mind how little. I did not like how she was used. That was my biggest problem with it.
The deus ex machina. Well, she comes in and then she just asks for secondhand information, and then she figures it out.
We don't see her figuring it out. We see her go into the police station, right? Like, that's all that happens. We see her talking to Megan. That's all that happens.
It's clunky. And the weirdness of the structure in the book that Curran points out, it's an interesting quirk within the greater Christie oeuvre, but there's a reason why she didn't do it that often, because it's not actually the most entertaining way to figure out who done it. To see the murderer do it and then get your explanation after the fact, or see the murderer trying to do it for a third time. That's actually not the best use of Miss Marple. I like that she springs these traps because she never does the grand denouements that Poirot does, but this is done in a particularly clunky way.
It's one of the worst uses of series-long characters that we've seen in any Christie book.
Yeah, no, I agree. I did like just this one little exchange between Mrs. Dane Calthrop and Miss Marple. I tell you, that woman knows more about the different kinds of human wickedness than anyone I've ever known. And then Miss Marple murmurs, I don't think you should put it quite like that, dear. So modest, our dark Marple.
I know. I do like, though, that she's just called into like random villages that are in St. Mary Mead as like a murder expert.
Right. I think we came out on a 4. That's what you would put down.
By the way, I wanted to say, because I know that I've gotten some knocks occasionally for teasing about Miss Marple, but my entire point is I wanted this to be Miss Marple. I wanted Miss Marple on all the pages.
We know that deep down you love Miss Marple, Catherine.
I do.
Okay.
It's true.
Your secret's out.
Yeah, everybody knows.
Everybody knows. So, book-specific characters. This isn't great. We don't really have to belabor this because we've already talked about it. I think we're coming out on a 5 on this because we've given a couple of 5s in the recent past. You know, we've had some books where I think, especially in comparison to A Five Little Pigs or And Then There Were None, the characters feel a little bit weaker in N or M, for example, or Evil Under the Sun or One Two Buckle My Shoe. I wouldn't go so low as a 4. The last time we gave a 4 was Dumb Witness, because I think that these characters are certainly fulfilling their function. They're just not doing much more than that. So I think a 5 out of 10 feels right.
Yeah, that's fine.
And then setting and tone, even though Christie didn't pull off whatever she was exactly trying to do with Jerry, I have to give her some credit for creating another breezy male narrator who was quite engaging. And you even said it too. This book is easy to read. And I think a lot of that goes to yet another breezy first-person narration. I appreciate when Christie does that. I think that these books often are so much more readable than her third-person books. I really enjoyed this book. It was more that when I finished it and reflected on what I had just read, that was a deflating exercise for me, but I wasn't mad when I was reading it. I think it's a fair argument to make that we should give it the same score for setting and tone that we gave to Murder is Easy.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of the same thing. We gave a 5 to Murder is Easy on setting and tone, and I think it's fair to do that again.
Totally fair.
Okay, and then Stuck in Its Time, I think we actually come out similarly on this. I feel pretty firmly that we should give it 1 deduction.
Okay.
Because there's not anything super egregious. As we mentioned, Mr. Pye could be read in a homophobic way. He doesn't necessarily have to be read that way, but there are a lot of references to him, some of them uncomfortable. They're all made within the voices of other characters. There's no third-person narrator here, so we can give Christie the benefit of the doubt for all these. The grossest one to me was actually when Jerry's enumerating the items of clothing that he buys for Megan in the course of her Pygmalion/My Fair Lady makeover.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
He actually includes the word undies.
Yeah, when he says it to the seamstress.
Oh, and then actually, so just in case we thought we escaped from this novel without any anti-Semitism, perhaps...
Oh, no, it's at the seamstress.
Perhaps the most offensive thing in this novel is this throwaway reference, and that's why it's offensive, because it's throwaway and it's meant to be comedic. This seamstress, Mary Gray, this is the quote, Mary Gray was being firm with a stout Jewess who was enamored of a skin-tight powder blue evening dress. Oh, Agatha.
Well, there's also some uncomfortable references to the Chinese. And then also we have Jerry and Joanna and their weird slave references.
Well, Mr. Pye makes one. He says that Emily Barton's mother treated her maids like, quote, black slaves, fetching and carrying and agreeing with her. And then Joanna makes the same reference when she and Jerry are arguing about how stern they should or should not be with Partridge. And she says they can't like being treated like black slaves. Those were uncomfortable as well.
Yeah, not good.
For a 21st century reader. But again, all slight, all from the mouths of characters inside of the story, and none feeling pervasive or coloring, I think, the overall read of the story, which is why they all add up to 1 point. But
yeah, they're
we need to take off a point.
For sure. They're incredibly cringe-inducing.
All right, well, that brings us to our tallying up portion of the episode. So for the moving finger, we have 6 plus 5 plus 4 plus 5 plus 5 minus 1, which equals 24 points, putting it... Oh boy, Catherine, we've got some discussing to do. You thought you were done, but we are not, because we we are now currently in a 5-way tie.
Oh, man.
There are 5 novels now that have 24 points, which is interesting. I love this clustering that's happening. This is our lowest cluster in the rankings. These are all novels that have fundamental problems, but aren't the lowest of the low. So here they are in a rank order from highest to lowest currently. The Mysterious Affair at Styles, The Murder on the Links, Dumb Witness, and The Mystery of the Blue Train. I think that it's better than all of them except for The Mysterious Affair at Styles.
I agree with you 100%, Kemper.
Fantastic.
That's exactly where I would also put it.
So this puts The Moving Finger in 25th place out of 33. And that's right, Catherine. We have just now, with the end of this episode, completed 33 novels by Agatha Christie. I've been waiting for so long to play this. We are halfway through the Christie canon. We have put The Moving Finger in roughly the bottom third of the rankings.
Which is, you know what? It's a surprise. It's a surprise to me, honestly.
It's a surprise to me, too. If you have any strong feelings about The Moving Finger, as we did, we would love to hear from you. Join us next week for a short story. We are returning to Parker Pine. The short story in question is, Have You Got Everything You Want? ? And then we should mention that we have an upcoming interview with friend of the podcast, Jamie Bernthal. We are so excited about that in the coming weeks. Email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is at allaboutagatha. And we would so appreciate it for those who haven't yet done so to take a moment and rate and review us and help other people find our podcast. And we will see you next time. Bye.